Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Friend Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, joined today by Mr. Terence Corrigan. Terence, how are you?
I'm okay, Nicholas.
And also Sara Gon. Sara, how are you?
I'm fine. I'm also stationary. Even my chair doesn't have wheels today.
Good. So we're going to start off today with, I think, what is quite a grim topic coming to us from over the weekend, from overseas. And this is the awful attack in Israel carried out by fighters from Hamas. So on the 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War in 1973, when Israel was surprised by its neighbors in a big attack, Hamas launched an operation where they fired about 3,000 rockets, mostly at southern Israel, but also their affiliates appear to have launched a couple at Jerusalem. And then they by land, air, and sea, using kind of these weird motorized paragliders, boats, and also guys breaching the border fence with Israel. Got something like 1,000 fighters over the border into Israel in a big surprise attack. And once being over, they carried out some really awful stuff. There was a music festival nearby to the border. It was supposed to be some kind of like peace festival thing. Looks like about 240 people were murdered there. Lots of people suffering horrific crimes. Lots of hostages taken. Lots of the communities on the border with Israel, between Gaza and Israel, were also attacked. In many cases, the incidents of taking hostages or shooting people was filmed by the Hamas guys. In some cases, they took the phones from the people who they were about to kill or take prisoner, and then posted on their Facebook accounts or on their Instagram accounts the things that they were about to do to people. There are still many people taken hostage in Gaza from that. Not all of them Israelis, some of them foreigners. I believe there's a Pole, there's some Americans, there's some Germans who are both among the dead and among the hostages as well. So in total, at least 700 Israelis have been killed, and apparently around more than 400 Palestinians in retaliatory airstrikes that the Israelis carried out in response to this. This has been called a massive intelligence failure on behalf of the Israeli government, which very strictly controls the border with Gaza and monitors it with drones and informants and all sorts of things. A spokesperson for the Israeli Defense Force says, "This is our 9/11. They got us. They surprised us. They came fast from many spots, both from the air and the ground and the sea." A Hamas representative in Lebanon told media organizations that the attack showed Palestinians had the will to achieve their goals regardless of Israel's military power and capabilities. There is reporting out now suggesting that this was planned probably months or years ahead of it actually being carried out. There was lots of sophistication in the way the border was breached. And there have been, apparently Hamas put out a lot of public messaging and also private messaging that indicated that they were really interested in, at the moment, economic concerns about making sure that people in Gaza had access to work permits and things to be able to work in Israel, uninterrupted access to electricity and water. And so the Israelis believed that they were not interested in a fight right now. And that appears to have just been a cover for this, creates the element of surprise of this attack. Israeli forces were not in force on the ground. Apparently, there had recently been clashes between settlers on the west, Israeli settlers on the West Bank, and Palestinians. And so IDF troops had been reduced in strength on the southern border to go and deal with that. The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has said that Israel is now in a state of war with Hamas. They have organized at least 300,000 reservists who have been called up, and it looks like they're set to enter the Gaza Strip probably any minute now. There's already been raids and airstrikes all over the Gaza Strip targeting Hamas. The Israelis also say that they have now cut water, power, and supplies into Gaza Strip, preceding their attack to take out Hamas. It is already sending shockwaves through the region. There is much to be asked about whether the Islamic Republic of Iran was involved in this at all. If it was, it might cause a bigger conflagration in the region because Iran is a big supporter of Hamas. Hezbollah, which is also closely tied to Iran, probably even more closely tied, has so far only in a very limited way intervened in the conflict, firing a few rockets at northern Israel, but appears to have not engaged in a major way, which perhaps suggests that Iran might not have been fully involved in this, although there's reporting in the Wall Street Journal that Iran was involved heavily in this operation. That all remains to be seen. We don't know what the truth is on that one. But an Israeli security source says they caused us to think they wanted money. All the time they were involved in exercises and drills until they ran riot. Lots of countries around the world have responded. The US has said that support for Israel was, quote, rock solid and unwavering, and ordered US ships and warplanes to move closer to Israel. Iran said that it supported the Palestinians' right to self-defense and warned Israel must be held accountable for entering the region. Senior advisor to Iran's supreme leader called the attack a, quote, proud operation. The chief of the EU, Ursula von der Leyen, said that the full-scale brutality of the Hamas terror attack leaves us breathless, defenseless people brutally murdered in cold blood on the streets. We stand strong with Israel and its people. Today, the EU and Israeli flags fly side by side. India said that it stood in solidarity with Israel at this difficult hour and was deeply shocked by the news of terrorist attacks in Israel. And South Africa said that, quote, it can no longer be disputed that apartheid South Africa's history is occupied Palestine's reality as a result of the decision by Palestinians to respond to the brutality of settler Israeli apartheid regime is unsurprising. And it also went on to say that the degenerating South African situation is directly the degenerating security situation is directly linked to the unlawful Israeli occupation. Sara, let me start with you. What do you make of this whole disaster? It really seems to me as though tensions around the world continue to rise. We've now got a number of major conflict zones. There's the stuff going on in West Africa following the coups. There's the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict, which has been heating up. There's, of course, the Russia-Ukraine war, which is just continuing to grind along. And now this explosion of violence, the worst that Israel has suffered in probably its entire existence, actually, in terms of just the straight up civilian death toll on a single day. What do you make of this?
Look, I don't think things will be the same. I think Israel, and Netanyahu in particular, has adopted a sort of, deal with the rocket attacks and terrorism as it occurs. It quietens down. Egypt negotiates a truce, and they've gone on this way. And they have, as I said, they've sort of tried to go the soft route of jobs, water, electricity, etc., because they want to, for the benefit of people who are quite apart and separate from Hamas as the party that governs them. I think it's interesting because my reaction wasn't horror, yes, but shock and surprise, no, because first of all, it is in the nature of Hamas. That is how Hamas operates. Given the chance, it has been given the chance, despite being a Sunni Arab organization. It has been heavily supported by Shia Iran, which is over the last few years been a different development. Hezbollah is a creation of Iran's. It is a Shia creation of Iran. Syria, which is also in the mix, is a Shia country. So the arming of Islamic Jihad, the arming of Hamas is relatively new, and it also goes to the confidence Iran has that America's foreign policy is frankly risible. And I think you have the problem from a Western point of view of the West tending to see a lot of the conflicts in the Middle East from a Western paradigm, not a Middle Eastern paradigm. And I think the problem for Hamas will ultimately be that however much, rape, the murder of civilians, hostage taking may be in its playbook, it will not play well in the West. And I think Israel will very likely say, this is it, we're taking out Hamas. I think it's an inevitable consequence. And also, when the Israelis lose lives, partly by their own failures, such as their intelligence failures, as well as the conflict that has been occurring in the streets of Israel over the democracy of Israel. Does it or doesn't it change the rules under which the Supreme Court operates? Very public, in the media for months, politicians behaving badly, elite defense units saying they're not going to fight for this government, forgetting, of course, that you never fight for a government, you fight for a country, first and foremost. Suddenly that's been brought home to reality. They weren't there. They took their eye off the ball, and they are reaping the dreadful consequences of that. And the problem is, I think, on the one hand, the West will see this as an attack. Hamas will have planned it as a major operation aimed at civilians, not aimed at the military. And it's part of that disjuncture between the paradigm of the Middle East and the paradigm of the West that is at play here. And if the rest of the world, or much of the world, gets drawn into it, it's always been the conflict that would draw people into it. America's sending its aircraft carrier fleet from the area into the area. I'm not sure who that's going to frighten. It sure isn't going to frighten Iran, because the Americans have adopted a principle of appeasement to a regime that, in no Western terms, behaves tolerably. So, yeah, more people are going to die, and more Palestinians are going to end up dying, and more Israelis are going to end up dying, but the Palestinian rate is going to increase because the Israelis are going to have unleashed the defense forces, and they operate militarily, and they will take out what needs to be taken out to protect Israelis. Protecting civilian life is sacrosanct in Israel, and the consequences are going to flow from that.
Very much so. This is definitely going to get very nasty now, I think. That's indisputable for pretty much everyone involved. And one does have to wonder what the sort of next stage is. What is Israel going to do? Are they going to actually place Gaza under the same kind of occupation they have in the West Bank and return it to the status quo before? I think they withdrew unilaterally back in 2005. I think this caught the Israeli government just as much by surprise. So I don't think they necessarily have a full plan for what they're going to do beyond the first sort of military actions to strike back on Hamas. Terence, firstly, your thoughts on this, but also your thoughts on South Africa's response to this. Officially speaking, South Africa is neutral in this conflict. The government often expresses its support for the two-state solution in the Israel-Palestine conflict. And yet, when you look at the description of their statement put out on this, it was more aggressive than the Saudi statement. Let's just put it that way, against Israel. What do you make of this?
Well, look, this is the kind of conflict that just keeps on giving, if you like. I've said, and please don't take this as an endorsement, but as a military operation, the planning and whatever, and it was executed extremely competently. And this is the kind of, this is an example of a very, very well executed small unit operation that can cause enormous damage on a militarily more powerful antagonist. They've sort of used those gliders to get over the border, cordoned off the area, blew the fence, used bulldozers, and then sent these Dune buggies and whatever to go and carry on. Now, obviously, this isn't an endorsement. It's simply saying that there is a huge degree of sophistication here. There's been some mention made of the sort of link to the Yom Kippur War in 1973, where Israel was also caught off guard in a religious holiday. I think a more fruitful way of understanding this is to think back to the Tet Offensive in Vietnam in 1968. So it's also this is a period of the year when fighting wasn't supposed to take place, because this was the Lunar New Year, and everyone was supposed to go back and sweep their tombs and connect with their families, and areas of the country that were from which U.S. and South Vietnamese forces had actually been redeployed were struck. The North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, we were also, don't let Hollywood fool you, the Viet Cong was a highly organized, sort of army. It wasn't just, people who picked up a pitchfork and went out to do battle. They had actually conducted operations specifically to draw American and South Vietnamese forces away from their targets. So this has been a long time coming. Now, the interesting thing is that within, I think it was a month, or actually not even a month, within days, that offensive had been blunted. Within 6 weeks, it had been completely reversed. And although there were subsidiary phases of the Tet offensive, it actually turned out to be a fairly significant win for the U.S. and South Vietnam. But what they were able to do is to inflict a massive political defeat. The idea that what was hitherto inconceivable, and I think this may be what comes out of this, the visual of a Merkava tank having been taken out. That's a huge propaganda coup. The idea that they could go and essentially execute 260 revelers. That there would be images of Israeli police having to fight their way into their police headquarters. All of those feed their own narratives. Now, I've no doubt that in military terms, this is going to turn into a massive defeat for Hamas. But I do think Israel find that, if they've taken a significant number of civilian hostages, that creates a massive political problem. Because I think that effectively undermines one of the great bargains that the Israeli state has with its people, that no one is left behind. They go to enormous lengths to get prisoners home and even just remains. And this says that in this particular instance they were unable to safeguard their civilian population. I think this could quite possibly be the end of Netanyahu, just like the Tet offensive was in many ways the end of Lyndon Johnson's presidency in America. As for foreign reactions, interesting. Many of the Arab countries sort of hedge their bets. De-escalation on all sides. This is all dreadful, passive voice type stuff. I don't really expect anything else there. A country like France, which often takes a more sort of Arabist position, and certainly is often critical of Israel, came out very strongly in favor of Israel. India apparently for the first time referred to this as terrorism. They've generally referred to Hamas as militants, which is, in terms of Israel's international support, a very interesting development. South Africa, well, reading that statement, you could almost this is exactly what they did with Russia and Ukraine. You could almost forget that it was Palestinians this time on Israeli real estate doing this. No, this was entirely Israel's fault, and apartheid settler Israel, complete, deep, which is yes, completely illegitimate, the Zionist entity. Equally interesting was what the ANC had to say, which seemed to be coming out and saying, well, we're actually on side with this particular action. That if the news reports are correct, their spokesperson said, well, we they had no choice but to escalate. Now, escalate might mean you set off a few more limpet mines, to try and take out those Merkava tanks. I'm not sure that escalate would, in any sort of decent sense, would mean, going into a rave and killing 260, unarmed young people. But, it also doesn't surprise me. What I do think it says, though, and I think we should be very concerned about this, is just the lack of intellectual firepower. I don't think that that Thabo Mbeki's government would have been any, less enthusiastic about the Palestinian cause, but I do think that they would have had the noose to sort of finesse their response. It should say, well, do we really want to be seen as being on the side of shooting revelers? Probably not. It's the same way they managed to say, it wasn't so lacquer to knock down the Twin Towers, but we also think that America's a warmongering imperialist thing. But the point is that they actually saw that you had to try, that there was some diplomacy here. What I see coming from South Africa is politics of the playground, and it's be very concerned about that.
No, I think that's exactly right. Sara, any final thoughts on this before we move on? You're muted, Sara.
My heart dies out of your face, etc. It's raised a whole lot of very interesting things. One is that the Arab world's responses, I mean, the UAE, I can't recall what was the response, but it was very measured, very concerned. Saudi was, if you think in years past, it would have been fire and brimstone. It wasn't any of that. We left the ANC with the fire and brimstone. The intellectual sort of sludge that is the ANC came on board for exactly those reasons. You see, what you do in a situation like this, even if you're the ANC, is you regret the taking of hostages, the killing of civilians, etc., and then you justify why it happens and why you support it. You don't not mention them at all. You don't show no sympathy at all. It doesn't matter who the combatants are, who the victims are. It's just not how diplomacy works. And what it shows is that there is absolutely no corner of South African politics untouched by the intellectual brevity of the ANC. And the other thing is the whole thing of the sort of concept of settlers and whether you have justification for being there or not being there. And this is very much a theme of the anti-Israel left. And it strikes me that you actually can't pick and choose your settlerism. If the Israelis are settlers, then so is every American whose history was, they come from people who were not born there. In other words, they crossed oceans. Same in South America, same in Australia, same in much of Europe, etc. If you didn't originate, if you weren't the Khoisan, or you weren't the Inuit, or you weren't the Native Americans, you're a settler. You originate from settlers. So maybe it's time we had that discussion. Right, and that is a huge discussion.
That's exactly kind of the sort of menacing underlying thing about this from the way the ANC talks about this. They're sort of, basically endorsing some of this violence. And the justification is, well, the Israelis are settlers. Well, they also call a lot of South Africans settlers too.
Including
which doesn't really...
1 2 settlers?
Yeah. But in the ANC's view, I mean, everyone on this podcast is a settler. So if violence is justified against Israeli settlers, even if they're civilians, then it makes you wonder what the ANC's perspective is on ordinary South Africans who are declared settlers by them. But anyway, let us move on. Let's discuss continue discussing the intellectual sludge that is the ANC sort of ambit at the moment by talking about the Central Committee meeting of the South African Communist Party, which was recently held. The South African Communist Party held a 3-day Central Committee meeting that ended, I think, on Sunday, and it was called to discuss the SACP's party's position ahead of the election next year, as well as what the South African Communist Party described as the government's austerity measures and other neoliberal policies. So they said that they want to, quote unquote, reconfigure their alliance with the ANC, which is a thing they do every single election, looking like they might stand as an independent party, and they're not actually doing it. Their general secretary said that the real problems in South Africa are not caused by, all of the things that we talk about, bad policy, misgovernment, all these sort of things. No, the real problem is that there has been, quote, a lack of respect for the ANC's political mandate, and that we have problems in South Africa because the ANC's previous election manifestos were not fully implemented after the past elections. He said the problem is exacerbated by private business, which has opened the floodgates of corruption in the country. And he recently talked about a recent visit by members of the ANC and the South African Communist Party to China for political school. And he implored his comrades to learn from their ally, the Communist Party of China. He says, in China, government plans are not changed willy-nilly by government ministers like in South Africa. Terence, what do you make of this?
Saying, respect my authority. Not really. Where does one start? Okay, yes, the Communist Party of China may not change all of its policies like overnight. For instance, they have been on the Uyghurs in concentration camps for a long time. They're not backing away from that one. But let's give our Chinese communist friends due credit that they decided that this whole great leap forward Mao revolution, destroy the world, to create a new one, wasn't such a great thing. So they said, well, let's make some money. There was a joke I once heard about the Chinese business delegation that came and wondered why we had so many strikes. And they said, look, in China, we don't have to, you guys obviously have to contend with communists. We don't. I'm afraid one of the issues that complicates any kind of move towards a sustainable resolution in the Middle East is the cloying role of politicized religion. And I was saying just before the show that one thing that the Vietnamese and the Chinese had was maybe their religion was political and therefore didn't reference a higher power, and they were able to step away from it to some extent. I think in South Africa we still have people whose religious and ideological convictions function very much like a supernatural religion, and I think we see it on display. And if only we worshipped harder at the shrine of ANC, National Democratic Revolution, it would be the thing that would make the thing great again.
Sara, what do you make of all this? I mean, the SACP is, in years past, was described as a sort of like intellectual brain trust of the ANC, and yet you see the you see what they're coming out with now, and it's just of such low caliber.
Well, I'm going to go with the suggestion #intellectual sludge.
All right, let's move on.
Terrifying.
All right, let's move on very briefly to our last story, because this is actually quite an interesting one, and I just want to talk about it recently. So there's this survey done of the power of brands across South Africa. Looks at about 1,000 brands with a representative sample of 12,500 South Africans. This is representative of South Africans on a provincial, racial, gender, language level. And this survey found that the Springboks are in an excellent position with South Africans, that the brand of the Springboks is extremely strong. Out of the 1,000 brands, the Springboks are rated 7th in leadership, 13th in most energetic, 17th in most dynamic, 16th in most progressive, 18th in most rugged, and the 34th most South African brand surveyed. It's got this very high approval amongst South Africans in general. And also, interestingly, when they compared the brands, and so by brand, they define it as basically what people associate, what sort of words and ideas people associate with a person or a product or a company. When they looked at the brands of politicians tended to rate among the lowest in the country in general. And when Springbok captain Siya Kolisi's brand was plotted against the EFF's Julius Malema and President Cyril Ramaphosa, Kolisi's brand came out much, much stronger. In fact, his personal brand was seen as one of the top quality brands, the top leadership brand, the most down-to-earth brand, the kindest, the friendliest, the second toughest, the 6th most charming, the 35th most intellectual, the 36th most energetic. And in contrast to how politicians were described, which is the people answering the survey described them as politicians are fatigued and arrogant. So, Sara, I mean, this didn't ask the question of whether you would vote for President Siya Kolisi, but it kind of seems as though people would, at least when you ask their gut feeling, would be willing to vote for President Siya Kolisi over all of our political figures. And isn't that interesting?
I think it's fascinating, and I'm going to create a new hashtag, Genius of Rassie Erasmus. Because, everyone knows the sort of PR problems that the Springboks have faced since 1994. And what he has done is been instrumental in literally rebranding. But it's not just rebranding, it's rebranding it's not just image, it is all about it. There's a lot of image in it, there's a lot of PR in it, but underneath that is the nous and hard work that goes into creating a team led by Siya Kolisi that just, it's in the face of everything that's sludgy and rotten in the society, whether we win the World Cup or not is not as relevant as the fact that we took part, and we took part in the way that we did. It's a multiracial team. It's probably the most diverse looking team, the most diverse team in the world of the World Cup. So I think it's branding. It is branding genius, and I do mean that with all due respect. I think it shows the political classes that with the right sort of branding genius, they are left standing, barely standing. Very smart, and kudos to having been able to turn around an entity like the Springboks, still called the Springboks.
Exactly. I think it's really a great South African success story when you look at this, the way that the Springboks, rugby was seen as this kind of like white thing and was associated with apartheid and stuff like that. And yet it really is now in many ways, according to this, the most popular of our sports in people's eyes. When people, not necessarily in what people watch, but it's the most popular in what people have positive associations with. The survey also looked at our cricket and rugby teams our cricket and soccer teams, and they found them to just not really be that great in people's eyes. And like you say, Rassie Erasmus has been a big part of building up this brand identity that really brings South Africans together and is excellent at the same time, right? We are one of the best teams in the world, and regardless of how we do in the World Cup, it's clear that we're going to maintain that spot at least for a while to come. And that really is, I think, the essence of the South African, of what can make a great South African success story. You've got this sort of brand and organization built on merit, built on collaboration of people from all over the country, and they've come together to make this thing that works really well. And it's also popular with South Africans from all racial groups and all economic groups as well. Terence, your final thoughts on this?
No, just I second you there. I don't think that anybody, apart from Trevor Manuel in the early days, has ever said, wow, we might have lost, but that team was so beautifully diverse. Yeah, it's taken a while, but when you have little barefoot Afrikaans kids and Posmasburg who want to be like Siya Kolisi, that this isn't the society it was 30 years ago. Look, but then as regular viewers in the show will know, I'm the ultimate couch potato. So you'd probably have to show me a picture of Siya Kolisi so I can identify him.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone, for watching. We hope that you found the show informative, and we will be back tomorrow with the Daily Friend Wrap. Cheers, everyone.